Where is God in the midst of the trials and suffering we face in life? Jesus told us that in this world we will have trouble, and the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation is filled not only with testimony to this fact, but with a theology of suffering that we must know, embrace, and pass on as an inheritance to our kids. If you're like me, you often wonder how God works in the lives of those who face unimaginable suffering. When all seems hopeless, is there any hope? Today, I chat with some young youth worker friends who have been and are in the midst of the unimaginable. Stick with us for a compelling conversation about real-life suffering, real-life hope, and a challenge to teach this to our kids on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, I'm Walt Mueller here at CPYU in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, and on this episode of Youth Culture Matters, I get to chat with a couple that I've known for years. Lisa and I have known them, and they have an amazing story. Just to back up a little bit, I was thinking back over the years of 3+ decades of doing youth ministry training and thinking about all the literally thousands of youth workers I've met and had the opportunity to be with over the years, and there are certain people who you just remember them and you click with them, and when you're with them at different events over the years, you sit with them and you chat with them, and we get to have that chat today with one of these couples, Dan and Kristin Sterk, who are joining us. You guys are in Michigan. Where exactly?
West Michigan, Holland, Zeeland area.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Holland, which is known for tulips and heated sidewalks.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm impressed that you know that.
Yes. Well, I've been there, and I've been there in winter, so I've been able to indulge in the blessing of the heated sidewalks. I've been there a few times. So, and that's really where we met for the first time, was in that area, right? So why don't you guys tell us just a little bit about, who you are, where you are, what you're doing in youth ministry, and then we'll jump into some of the early conversations that we had together as couples. You guys, and then me and Lisa. And I want folks to hear your story, because this is not just if you're listening, this is not just like a memoir. This is a story that really matters for us, because we're going to talk today with them about, what it means to suffer and suffer well, and how we can teach our students a theology of suffering, our parents, other youth workers, a theology of suffering, because you guys have lived it. So before we get into the specifics of that, just tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Yeah, we're Dan and Kristin Sterk. We've been married 17 years. I had to
You hesitated. That's a problem,
quick.
Dan.
I did.
Yeah.
After the first couple of years, it all just kind of melts into one. But we met in college and started dating. Then I was going into youth ministry, and Kristin was going into social work, and started talking about getting married, but I didn't know if she would want to be married to a youth pastor, because churches always look for that 2-for-1 deal. And so she said no, that was on my list of things I was looking for in a future husband. I wanted to be a youth pastor's wife. So we got married, and we've done ministry together pretty much since day one. And we've bounced around a little bit. We were in Southwest Michigan, then we moved out to Minnesota for 4.5 years, and then out of the blue, my college roommate called and asked if we would be willing to come to his church and do youth ministry there. And so that was something that I'd always wanted to do. So we came back to the West Michigan area, and we'd had our daughter out in Minnesota, but we wanted her to be by family. So both of our families are in this general area. So we moved back, and we've been at our church now, North Street CRC, for 5.5 years now.
Okay.
So,
you hesitated again. I'm not going to ask you any more dates.
Dates are not his forte, Walt.
Now, just to clarify, so the church, you said CRC, that's a Christian Reformed church.
That is correct.
Which is rooted in the Dutch tradition and great theological tradition, some good thinking and ministry practice coming out of that. So folks who are not familiar with that, that's the CRC. So let's rewind, and we were talking before we started to record about when we first met.
Yes.
So you actually remembered better than I did. I remember some of the later meetings.
Well, I got stage fright when I met you. So we were actually at a local church seminar, like a one-day meeting, and I think we had a break for lunch, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I was standing there at one of the urinals, and all of a sudden you walked in and stood next to me.
I just stood there.
I got stage fright, and I couldn't finish. So I had to just walk out, and then you ended up sitting down and eating lunch with Kristin and I and the rest of our volunteer youth group leaders, and got to chatting, and then we went to another weekend-long conference and ran into you and Lisa again. And I forgot what the actual seminar that one was about, but we got to talking to Lisa, and one thing led to another, and we just kept talking. And then a year later, Lisa called us out of the blue and said, "Hey, if you guys are going to the youth ministry conference, we'd love to have breakfast with you." And the rest was history from there.
Yeah, so you connected with Lisa, which is great when that happens. She's so good at reaching out to people like that. And the beginning of that story, well, it does divulge a lot of information. Actually, some of the best conversations really are when we meet in places like that, and we're washing our hands at the sink or whatever, and just greeting each other and then being able to eat with you guys. So I do remember going out there. It was actually was it in the Zeeland area with Dwayne Smith? Was that Eagle Crest?
I think
Eagle
it was,
Crest Ministries, which he was running at the time, and he was doing a lot of youth ministry training, and he would have me come out there. It was usually when it was very cold. It
was winter.
Yeah, it was like 11 months out of the year it's like that. So I understand why you went to Minnesota and you didn't even flinch. So let's jump into a little bit of your story, because when we first met you, part of what drew us into you was hearing some of what was happening in Kristin's life at the time. So let's jump over to her and talk a bit about, since our topic's suffering, talk a little bit about how that all began for you and walk us through the history of that.
Yeah, so my story really encompasses quite a medical journey. I was born with a heart defect, but didn't know about it until I was 17. And while I was at a basketball sports physical, I ended up needing an open heart surgery to correct the problem, but that all went well. But unfortunately, over the next few years, they noticed that my mitral valve, which is one of the valves in the heart, started to leak more and more. And so through these routine heart appointments, we kind of learned that it would be a little risky to have a child at the time. But in 2014, I was at one of those routine heart appointments, and the doctor said, "Hey, Kristin, your heart is actually looking really good." And Dan and I kind of looked at each other. Dan kind of leaned forward and asked, "Well, what does that mean for pregnancy?" And our doctor kind of looked at us like, "Why would you even ask that question?" She said, "Well, I see no problem with it." And according to the nurse, we about fell out of our chairs because we were so shocked that God had miraculously healed my heart to the point where we could have a child. So a month later, I became pregnant. And in 2015, I gave birth to our daughter, Maisie Grace. And yeah, she's named after the song Amazing Grace, because it was only by God's grace that we had her. So unfortunately, after I had her, I went through pretty severe heart failure and never really fully recovered from that. So when we moved back to Michigan, I ended up getting referred to a doctor at the University of Michigan. And they discovered that mitral valve that was leaking really needed to be repaired. And so I went in for my second open heart surgery, and it all went well. In fact, so well that the doctor said that I could run marathons and have more kids if I wanted to, but I can't say that that was really what I wanted in life at that time. But really, it was just good to hear that I had that type of a prognosis. About a week after being home, I got really sick, and we didn't know if I just had a bug or what was going on. But I went to the emergency room, and a few hours later, I found myself being flown via helicopter back to the University of Michigan. And that's where they discovered that the repair that was done on my heart blew. And so I ended up getting quite sick, was in the ICU for a week, wasn't even healthy enough to have another open heart surgery at that time. So, and my organs started to fail as well. So it ended up kind of becoming a little bit of a life and death situation. But thankfully, God healed me enough to the point where I could have that third open heart surgery. And it was the second in 16 days. And you think you can do it, but at the same time, it was very intense.
Yeah. Dan, what was for you? Okay, and you've got a little one.
She was
but just,
2.
So just and you're doing youth ministry. I mean, just talk through what that was like for you as a husband. To me, it's unimaginable. I can't get my hands or my head around what that must have been like. I mean, 3 open heart surgeries. And how old were you when you had the third?
Oh goodness, that was in 2017.
Don't ask Dan.
I think I was 34 or
Okay.
33 or 34.
Yeah. So I mean, people need to understand that we're talking about a young person here who, 17 all the way up to 34 or however old you were with the third one. And so you were through a lot at that point. Let me go to Dan and just, your perspective as how you were walking through this and handling this, and what was most helpful to you, just in terms of support. I'm thinking about not only what you leaned into, scripturally and biblically, but also in terms of your folks who were with you, your church family.
Yeah. Well, it was Halloween that she went back into the ER, and my mom had made a Halloween costume for our daughter, and so she was all excited to go trick-or-treating. But when she went back into the ER after that, I guess, second heart surgery, we're sitting there trying to figure out what's going on. And they said they were going to call in Aeromed and load her on the plane. And we're getting ready or load her on the helicopter. And we're getting ready to load her in. And Kristin looked down at me and said, "Make sure you take Maisie trick-or-treating still." It's like, oh my goodness, we're loading you on a helicopter and you're worrying about her trick-or-treating. So loaded her on the helicopter that took off. I quick ran home, grabbed her daughter, went trick-or-treating, dropped her off at my in-laws, and then I flew as fast as I could down the highway to get over to Ann Arbor, where they're going to take her back to the University of Michigan, and talk to our pastor on the way. And he said, "Dan, you just you stay there and take care of your family. We can't expect you to take care of our church family if you can't take care of your own family." So I stayed there the whole time. I think that round you were in the hospital for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
What year was that again?
2017.
Okay, 2017.
So yeah,
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, about 5.5 years ago.
Yeah.
I had just been at our church for maybe 4 or 5 months, just started, and then vanished for a little bit. But yeah, our parents, both of our parents took turns watching our daughter Maisie, and she kind of bounced around, and then we came back home. But that was really a struggle for her, and we didn't realize that until years later, just this separation anxiety and this fear that she's going to be left behind again. So yeah, that's a battle we've struggled with her. But I think something that we clung to a lot through all of that was 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, where it says, "When I am weak is when God is strong." And that's when Paul was pleading to God 3 different times to remove this thorn from his side. And God's reply was, "You know what? My grace is sufficient." And never took that thorn out. And so we didn't know if God was going to heal Kristin's heart or what was going to happen, but we knew that his grace was sufficient. And there was one night where all of Kristin's organs were shutting down, and they weren't able to do another surgery yet because she still wasn't stable. But the doctors told her to call me and have me get back to the hospital room quick. So I got dressed and ran over to her room, and they said, we're going to potentially have to open up her chest cavity and insert a bypass pump because her heart's not functioning well enough. We're going to put her on this medication, and if that doesn't work, then we're going to have to go through with this procedure. And Kristin said, well, if they open me up, and then they would leave her sedated until she was stable enough to do this surgery. She said, if they do that, you just go home. Don't sit here and watch me sedated. So we started praying that this medication would work, and we called some friends, had them start praying. This is probably about midnight, and they started praying. After about the first hour, numbers weren't getting better, so we were starting to wait for this doctor to come in and say, yep, we're going to go through with this procedure and open up her chest cavity and insert this bypass pump. Well, another hour went by. I think another half hour went by, and finally the doctor came in and said, no, we're comfortable with where things are at. And that was just a time where, you got to a point where there was nothing we could do about it. We couldn't fix it. We couldn't make it better. All we could do was just sit there and pray. And I don't like getting to that point. I like to be able to fix things myself, but when there's not a thing you can do about it, we came to a complete peace about it, knowing that it's not up to us to fix it. We just lean on God, and where he leads, we will follow. And so, yeah, I think that was on a Thursday night. It was that following Monday that ended up doing your third open heart surgery.
And too, when we were praying and praying, sometimes I wish I could go back to that faith that I had back then. We found ourselves saying, if God would get greater glory through me not making it, well, then that's what we wanted. Now, want is I say that loosely because humanly speaking, that is not what we wanted. Of course, we wanted you to make it. But at the same time, we were so filled with God's love for us at that moment that we just wanted to give him glory with no matter what he was going to bring us through.
And yeah, and that's the miraculous thing. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about that, as Dan mentioned, God's promised measure of grace. So if we anticipate difficulty, if we anticipate, we wonder how we can get through it. But in the midst of it, and you're living, breathing testimony to this, God does deliver on that promise. And, as Chris and I sit here and listen to this, it's pretty amazing. You've experienced it. And I know that we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this, because I know that this is part of what we need to teach our kids who have not yet suffered. That, we've walked through this, and you talk about, the suffering of Christ. You talk about the testimony of the Apostle Paul and others who, even through history suffered because of their faith, suffered physically because of their faith, maybe different circumstances than yours, and just how God was present in that. So it's amazing as I sit here listening to this. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the story, because it does not end there. So we'll be right back. Hey there, Youth Culture Matters listeners. We've been told that one of our best-kept secrets here at CPYU is our one-minute daily podcast, Youth Culture Today. Each and every weekday, we release a new episode that's timely, practical, and hope-filled, all for an audience of parents, youth workers, and anyone else who cares about kids. Here's a sample from one of our recent Youth Culture Today episodes.
Youth Culture Today with Walt Mueller of the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding.
Everyone who has ever walked the face of the earth has been made by God for a relationship with God. Because our rebellion and sin has severed that relationship, there remains a deep yearning inside each human being to have that relationship restored. Whether our teenagers know what to call it or not, Blaise Pascal described this universal hole in the soul as a God-shaped vacuum. Alistair McGrath describes Pascal's model as a God-shaped emptiness within us, which only God can fill. We may try to fill it it in other ways and with other things. Yet one of the few certainties of life is that nothing in this world satisfies our longing for something that is ultimately beyond this world. While it may at times seem like it isn't so, your teenager is no different than anyone else. His great need is to have this God-shaped emptiness filled by God. Even when they don't recognize it as such, we can rest in the assurance that their hunger is for heaven, and our calling is to point them to the cross.
For more on youth culture, visit us on the web at cpyu.org.
Youth workers, do your parents a favor and get them to subscribe to Youth Culture Today, wherever they get their podcasts. Well, welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Youth Culture Matters. Again, I'm Walt Mueller here at CPYU, and we're having a chat that is really quite moving. I mean, Chris and I are sitting here pretty amazed at what we're hearing. I mean, I've known this story for a while, but hearing it again from Dan and Kristin just about the journey the Lord has taken them on. Dan and Kristin are in youth ministry in Michigan, and there's been a lot of I don't know if I want to call them interruptions on your journey, unexpected.
Yeah, I call them interruptions.
Okay, interruptions. That's fair. Interruptions. Interruptions and pit stops that relate to most of them just physical issues that you guys have had to deal with Kristin and her heart. And before the break, I said, the story doesn't end there. You talked about 3 open heart surgeries by even before your mid-30s, wondering whether you would ever have children. Then Maisie Grace, and that right there, I mean, that's a great story about how you named her. That's just such a beautiful thing. So, let's go back to Kristin here and continue the story. Last fall, something happened, and I spotted this on Facebook as you reached out for prayer and just letting people know, because you've actually blogged on your journey for a long time and wrote a book about this called A Heartbeat of Grace, which we'll connect to, which folks can get. We want to hear more about that a little bit later. But you had to go in for another checkup or some kind of procedure in September, and then different news pops up.
So after those 2 open heart surgeries, my heart never really fully recovered, those back-to-back surgeries. And I ended up getting diagnosed with stage 3 heart failure, and there's 4 stages. And so because of that, I have structural issues and also electrical issues in my heart. And so this past fall, I was admitted for my 4th ablation. And ablation is basically where the doctors go into the heart and zap the areas of the heart that are misfiring. So I was put under for my 4th ablation, and I woke up to the doctor telling me that they couldn't complete the procedure. And I thought that was kind of odd. I had never had that happen before. And the reason was my blood counts were low. Again, didn't understand what he was trying to tell me at that time. So I was wheeled back up to the hospital room, and a few hours later, a hematologist came into our hospital room and started asking me lots of questions about my health, if I had been feeling sick. And at the time, I'm like, no, I'm here for a heart procedure. And she then knelt down by my bed and said, Kristin, we believe that you have cancer. And we were just absolutely floored. And then it wasn't maybe but an hour or 2 later, an oncologist came in and said that I had leukemia. And we never saw that coming. And in fact, about a month prior, Dan and I were sitting by our pool together talking about my upcoming heart procedure. And I said to Dan, wouldn't it be crazy if I ever got diagnosed with something other than heart failure, something like cancer? And I look back at that moment and I just think what God was probably thinking when I said that. So I never went home that evening. I got immediately wheeled up to the cancer floor at the University of Michigan, where I would spend 3 weeks receiving chemo treatments. And they went well, but over the past 4 months, I've had to go in for week-long treatments back to U of M for the past 4 months. But I'm also thrilled to say that I am in remission as of right now, and the doctors are hopeful that they'll be able to keep me in remission.
Mm. And by the way, for folks who are on Facebook, if you're still on there, you post a lot of your story on there, which is really helpful because that's what keeps us abreast of how to pray for you. And that, man, when I saw that, I went home and I told Lisa, I said, "You're not going to believe this." And actually, there's a little bit of a funny story in this, Dan. I'm not going to give the details of our texting exchange, but I had been communicating with you guys more so through Facebook, and I was sitting on the couch one night when I saw some more of this and was just floored by this and was prompted to text you. So I called up your name in my contacts, and I'm sending these texts, and I sent them for probably a multiplicity of days. You were not answering. I was getting a little concerned about what might be going on. You know, Dan and Kristin, hey, we're praying for you, this, that, and the other thing. And finally, I get this text back. And I'm not going to repeat what was in the text, but it was 5 words, and it was a profanity, started it, an extreme profanity, and then followed by the words you, Walt, and Lisa. And I sat there, I about fell out of my chair, and I thought, man, it's finally gotten to Dan. And he has just, and then that's when, like, I was stunned by it. And then I think I got to you through Facebook, and I said, Dan, I'm so sorry. Is everything okay? And you said, that's not my phone number. And I realized you had changed your cell number from when I had put you in my contacts, and somebody was getting really irritated with me and my constant, reminders, asking what's going on, and I'm praying for you. And so I actually did respond to that person and said, I'm sorry. I was texting a friend who has a wife who has cancer right now. And it was not only an explanation, but it was a guilt. It was a guilt thing I was heaping on this person on the other end who I have no idea who they are. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. I hope your friend is okay. But it was just like stunning to get this response that seems so out of character for you. But then, so in the midst of that, now again, you've got Maisie at 7 years old, and you talked a little bit earlier about even at 2.5, when you were going through the surgeries, just the sense of, is my mom going to come back? Where's my dad? She's being watched by people who love her. But talk a little bit about that journey, because what I saw, and people, again, they got to go to Facebook and find you, Kristin, but the pictures, and Dan, you put them up as well, just the beauty of Maisie, and it just seemed from a distance like she was ministering to you. Talk a little bit about that journey for her.
Yeah, when Kristin was going through those heart surgeries and she bounced around between my parents and Kristin's parents, I just realized that really created a separation anxiety. And when she started school, we would literally drag her out of the house, kicking and screaming, and she'd be grabbing on the door frames, not wanting to go, because she was just so afraid that something was going to happen and that she'd get left behind. And so we actually got her in to see a counselor and worked through that. Ironically, the counselor's name is Kristin Sterk. Just strange, totally not related, but that is
bizarro.
Very
so bizarre.
Very, yeah. Both tall and blonde, so it was strange. But that helped quite a bit. But then when we got this cancer diagnosis, I said, I need to stay home with Maisie this whole time. We can't force her to bounce around. And so I stayed in the hospital as long as I could with Kristin. And then it was about a 2.5-hour drive back to the other side of the state. And so I literally flew to pick her up from school because I didn't want her to find out from somebody else, hey, so sorry, your mom has cancer. I wanted to pick her up. Got stuck in a traffic jam and got through that, though, and picked her up in time, and picked her up from school. And she was kind of confused as to why I was there and where's mom. And so I started to explain to her, mom didn't have this ablation done, but they actually discovered she has leukemia. And how do you explain leukemia to a 7-year-old? But on the way to picking her up, I said, I'm going to tell her everything that's going on in a way that she will understand, within reason. I'm not going to go into the details of really her leukemia is, in the blood, and it's a malfunction with the 16th chromosome. She's not going to get that. So I, picked her up and explained yeah, leukemia is cancer in your blood, and they're going to give her some really nasty medicine, but it's going to make that cancer go away. And it was kind of about the time we were getting ready to close our pool for the summer, and I hadn't kept up on the chemicals and whatnot. And so our pool had actually turned green. And so I said to our daughter, I said, leukemia is kind of like our green pool. It's not just one section of the pool or one spot, it's throughout the whole pool. And the best way to make it clean again is to add these nasty chemicals that, if you pour them on you, they're going to hurt, shock or chlorine, whatever, but that those chemicals will clear up the pool. And so she totally got it. And then explained to her, mom might lose her hair by going through chemo, which we later found out the chemo she went through wouldn't cause her hair to fall out. But I told her, I will pick you up from school every day. I will take you to school every day. I will be home with you every night. I'll put you to bed every night. I will be there. And you and I can go see mom every weekend. She was playing rec soccer at that time. So after the games finished Saturday morning, we'd jump in the car and drive over to Ann Arbor, and we'd stay at a hotel in the hospital. And I said, I will be with you every single day, but we get to see mom every single weekend. And so, yeah, we would show up there, and she would climb in the hospital bed with Kristin and brush her hair, because she thought at that time we still thought she might lose it. So she would, brush Kristin's hair, and then she would push her around the hospital in a wheelchair. The hospitals were pretty empty on the weekends, so we didn't have to worry about running into other people. But a 7-year-old pushing a wheelchair is quite interesting. But then she'd get tired of pushing the wheelchair, so she'd just climb in Kristin's lap on the wheelchair, and I'd push him around the hospital. And it was just a sweet blessing of a time. And we'd leave Sunday afternoon so we could get back home in time for youth group that night. And that was usually probably the worst time of those visits, just watching Maisie realize I'm going to have to leave soon, and I'm going to have to say goodbye to mom for another week. Mm-hmm. And they would cry and just kind of hug and hold each other. And I'd carry her out to the car. We'd get in and drive past her hospital room up on the 7th floor, and Maisie would be hanging out the window waving at Kristin. And we'd go home and do a week together at home, and then go back the next weekend. But it was just an awesome time for the two of us, just to connect and create special bonds. We did fun events, whether we were going to youth group kids, soccer games, tennis matches, or whatever, or swim meets. We'd go out for dinner every single night. We just stayed busy. And so, in all honesty, she cried twice, maybe. Thought about Kristin losing her hair, and the thought that it was, at that time, we thought it was going to be 5 weeks. Mm-hmm. But Kristin's a fighter, and she got to come home after 3 weeks. So, and I told her, when the doctors tell me mom can come home, I will pick you up from school and we will go get her. And so we had found out on a Monday night, I think you're going to come home the next day. So I dropped her off at school Tuesday morning. I said, I'll be back in 2 hours and we'll go get mom. And so we did. It was a fun trip.
And I saw you rang the bell recently. How long ago was that?
That was almost a week ago tomorrow.
Okay.
Yes.
And so what's next?
Basically, I have to go in every month for blood draws, just to kind of see where what they're called blasts with the leukemia, to see if those have come back. And then every 3 months, I'll go in for a more in-depth blood test at the University of Michigan to see, if the leukemia has come back. The chance of relapse is greater in the first year, especially lessens the second year. But then after the second year, the chance of relapse is significantly lower. And then after about 5 years or so, if it hasn't come back, then you're cured of the leukemia.
So what's next with the heart? Because that's all been put on hold, right?
Yes, it has. Thankfully, even though Ann Arbor is far away from here, 2.5-hour drive, all three of my teams. So my advanced heart failure transplant team, and then also my arrhythmia team, and then my oncologist, they're all at the University of Michigan. So they're all in cahoots with each other of trying to figure out how to handle Kristin and her crazy medical journey. So basically, my arrhythmia doctor wants to revisit the idea of an ablation in April. To kind of give my body a chance to recover from this cancer and my blood counts to recover. But they do want to try to do another ablation. And really, the tricky part is I am close to a heart transplant, but if I would have one right now, they fear that I would probably need two in my lifetime. And so they're trying to do all the procedures that they can. So, I mean, an ablation is a fairly routine procedure, I guess. Mine are a little more complicated, but if this ablation would work, they'd be able to fend off this transplant a little bit more. So every year I go through kind of the routine testing of what it would look like if I did qualify for a transplant.
So a question. I mean, you've talked a lot about what you've learned. You've talked more about the story, which I wanted to hear, but in the midst of that, as you guys look, and I know you're still in the car, you're still driving forward, you see uncertainties ahead, but as you look in the rearview mirror, lessons learned, just about suffering and life and faith and grace.
Yeah, I would say I just actually read a quote from Elizabeth Elliot in her book, Suffering is Never for Nothing. And it says, suffering is when you want what you don't have or not having what you want. And I think so oftentimes we go through life thinking that we deserve an easy life, that we're here to just be happy and safe. But we can't focus on our good. We have to focus on our good God. And I think so oftentimes we confuse those two, that our good God and our all-powerful, all-knowing God wouldn't allow something like this. And believe me, I went through those same questions in my head when I was diagnosed with leukemia. I thought, how could an all-good God allow stage 3 heart failure and leukemia at the same time, especially when the chemo for heart failure, the chemo for leukemia causes heart failure. So I thought this is just like a hopeless situation. But in realizing that our good God still allows these things, and he's still good despite our circumstances in our life. And we're not here to live an easy life. And in fact, in John 16:33, it says that we will have trouble in this world. And I think we conveniently want to skip over that verse, but that's a truth statement from God. And I think we want to poo-poo that idea, like, oh, God wouldn't allow that in my life. To be honest, I never thought in a million years I would have cancer too. But I look back and I see how good God has been through our journey. Now, I think that there is a difference between being happy and being joyful. But you can be sad and you can be joyful at the same time. You can be filled with gratitude and cry at the same time. And I think in our generation, in our world right now, we have to, people want to separate those two, like, oh, you can't be thankful and sad at the same time. But no, like, that's what God has called us to.
I think we often think that, how would a good, loving God allow good people to suffer? But suffering, it doesn't prove that God isn't good. In fact, the greatest suffering ever proves the greatest good of God. Christ's suffering on the cross. It's just amazing. We can't fathom the depths of that. It's suffering doesn't prove that God isn't good.
I kind of
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I kind of wish I brought a box of Kleenex in here. This is getting to me. I'm looking at Chris. Oh, he's got them. Yeah, I was looking at Chris, and I was almost going to ask Chris, are you crying? Because it's so moving to hear this and the truths, not only what you've been through, but the realities of what you have experienced. It's great. We need to take a break. Now, when I come back, what we're going to talk about with the Sterks is, how can we in our families and in our youth ministries prepare our kids to have a realistic notion of exactly what they were just talking about there at the end in terms of suffering and the place of suffering in our lives. Because I don't think we've done a good job of that. I think we've many times told kids and adults a lie that when you come to Jesus, everything's going to be great. And, ultimately we live for eternity, right? We understand that everything's going to be renewed, the new heavens and the new earth, and we look forward to that. But that doesn't mean, as you folks have said, that everything's going to be easy and smooth here. But yet, boy, we've been nurtured into certainly wanting that, way too many times expecting that. So we're gonna broach that when we come back. Stay with us.
If you enjoy listening to Youth Culture Matters and would like to support the ongoing efforts of this ministry, you can do so by visiting cpyu.org/giving to make a donation. Your prayers and financial support make this podcast possible.
Well, Dan and Kristin, I want to be sure we point people to some of what you've written as you've processed on this. I know, Kristin, you've blogged since, as you said, 2010. Where can people go to, peek over your shoulder and get into your head and into your heart on this journey as you've blogged about it? Because as so many people do, and you've done it so well, you invite us in and we learn as we walk alongside you and pray for you. So where can people find that?
So I started a blog back in 2010, and it's www.kristinsterk.com. And I created that website because I wanted to hear other people's stories. I'm a firm believer that God has given each of us a story to tell. And I thought through maybe the sharing of my own story that people would feel a little more confident, a little more sure about what God was doing in their life. And so the more I started to write, the more I started to get responses from people about a difficult situation that they were going through. And so the more I find myself open, the more I find others open as well. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned through blogging is that we all have a voice and we're all here on this earth for a reason. Like, God has a unique story written for each of us, and it's kingdom worthy. And so being able to share about my heart failure and about my cancer, it has hopefully allowed others to realize, wow, God is working in my life too. And if that same God can work in Kristin's life through those difficult situations, he can work through mine too. And so really, I think one of the biggest lessons I learned is that through suffering, through going through difficult situations, it draws us closer to God. And it seems like such a cliche statement, but really that is the goal of our life here too, is for Jesus to draw us closer to him. And so even though we live in this fallen world, it's still, God can redeem those situations. He can redeem cancer, he can redeem heart failure and use it for his glory.
So give us, what I want to leave people with is, just from your perspective, what are some recommendations? You've talked a bit about a perspective on suffering. Can you push us to teach a theology of suffering? I think we really need that. We were talking during the break that, if you start the Bible in Genesis, if you start reading from Genesis to Revelation, the scriptures from start to finish, if you're thinking suffering as you read, it's amazing. Just from start to finish, it's there. I mean, why would we not expect it? Nobody likes it. Nobody welcomes it, but it's to be expected, and we're invited into it, to fellowship with in the sufferings of Christ and how we're refined and we grow. And certainly, what the story you're telling today, what I hear is a story of difficulty and pain and brokenness, but also tremendous growth in the midst of that as you go through that. And knowing you guys and having this conversation, I mean, it's real. So I'd like to hear about that. Just, push us a little bit, push youth workers and parents into understanding that and how to best teach that. And then maybe just a little bit about how to best walk alongside of people who suffer. Because we're going to have students who get difficult diagnoses or who have to deal with difficult situations in life. We're going to have students who are going to have difficult diagnoses of siblings and parents and struggles. Death and heartache. I mean, that's part of the curse, right? And the sufferings of life. And so we can all expect that. So how can we walk with them as well? And I know you've learned a lot about just being a parent and walking with a child. And boy, that was really touching how Dan talked about that. And again, even Maisie's name, I mean, it's just amazing. But so does that give you enough to talk about here as we finish up? I want you to challenge us, help us walk better through these things, those of us who have not gone through it.
Yeah. So often, we create this God that serves our beck and call, or a God that accepts us without changing us, or a God that will whisk us off to heaven someday without tossing us through the storm. But that's the type of God we create in our imagination. It's not the God we read about in Scripture. I think it was John Piper wrote in a sermon once that I read. He said, "I've never heard anyone say the deepest and rarest and most satisfying joys of my life have come in times of extended ease and earthly comfort." Nobody ever says, that time of just bliss and pure joy, oh, I grew so close to God. That never happens. Or I shouldn't say never. It rarely happens. It's those times when we're brought to our knees that we are drawn closer to God. And so we should expect those tough times, and it's inevitable. It's going to happen. We should expect those storms in life. But you have the opportunity to choose how you respond in them. You can focus on your environment, what's going on around you, but that's going to change. It's going to, get tossed around by the waves, but you can also focus on your environment, your IN environment, and that's what's inside you. That's Christ in you, your resources, your faith. You focus on those, and if you don't focus on yourself, but you focus on glorifying God, there's just so much strength that comes out of that. So you can choose how you respond, to choose on the things that change, or choose on, or to focus on the constant, which is Christ. That really can affect your outlook and just the way you represent Christ.
I
like to.
Oh yeah, can I just respond to him for a minute? Dan, I'm guessing that with your students in your ministry, because they've walked through this with you, right? So they've seen it, and then they've heard you say what you just said. That's been really helpful to them, hasn't it? I mean, how has that shaped them? Yeah,
we love the song from way back. I think it was a Matt Redman song, "Blessed Be the Name."
Yeah.
The song goes about, good things happening. Hey, blessed be God's name. Bad things happen. Blessed be God's name. How do you sing "Blessed be God's name" in both circumstances? And that's something we've really tried to do, and say, all praise to God if Kristin is healed, but if she's not, then hey, that's a road we'll walk through. We have some youth group students who just lost their mom last night, and so we're in the midst of that with them as well, walking through that. How do you handle that? It's, to be honest, there's no good easy answer. Those are the kind of times where, what do you say? Well, to be honest, I don't know really that you can dump any deep theological truth on them in that moment that's going to fix everything and make it better. But sometimes just being there, and just even being silent, just to be there with them, I find that is far more effective than, trying to think, okay, what's this verse I want to share with them, or this deep theological truth. Just love on them and listen.
I would say I experienced that even in the hospital. I was able to have, due to COVID, I could not have a more than one visitor at a time. But I would have friends just come and sit with me and not have to say anything. Sometimes I would fall asleep. And even through those open heart surgeries too, I was able to just be with. It's that be with factor that I think is so key in this day and age. We've never been more connected to each other, but I also feel like we've never been more distant from each other. And I think through the theology of suffering, like Dan was talking about, don't dump a big theological truth on them, which obviously there's a time and place for that. But really, we need a personal God. And I think we've lost touch with that God is still a personal God, even through suffering. And, you look at Job, and I feel like it's such a cliche guy to talk about when we're talking about suffering. But the book of Job starts out with talking about him being blameless and upright. So he had no sin as far as we're aware of. But then all of a sudden, God took his wealth, his health, and his children. And his friends told him to blaspheme the name of the Lord. His wife kind of said, curse God. But really, in the end, Job stood firm, and he said some really powerful words of like, he knew the plans of God could not be thwarted. And I truly look to Job as someone I look up to. I look at Noah. I can't say I would be that person building that ark in the middle of a desert. I wish I had the faith of Noah. You look at Stephen, he was stoned, and Hannah, she had infertility trouble. And so you just look at all these people of the Bible, and they're such Sunday school answers, but they're also the answers that we need to hear to realize that these are ordinary people that God chose to place on this earth at that given time. And that's where I feel like embracing our own stories, like God has you in a specific area, in a specific school system, at a specific church for a very pointed reason. And it's our job and ability and responsibility to try to figure out what that looks like.
Boy, this is so good. I know we need to bring this to an end. I'm just going to remind everybody that as we talk to Dan and Kristin and we hear this story, and it's still, well actually during the break, Kristin said we could talk about this for hours, right?
Yes.
So there's so much more to it, and that's where I want to point you again to her blog. Tell us again where that is, and we'll include a link.
Yep, KristinSterk.com.
Okay, KristinSterk.com. That goes to you, not the counselor.
That is correct.
Yeah, you stole that first.
It's
That's good.
I-N, Kristin.
Yes. Okay.
Sterk.
So we'll include the link. Chris Wagner here at CPYU will put all the links in the show notes for this particular episode, and you can check all those things out. I do want to ask this question, resource-wise. Besides the book that you wrote, A Heartbeat of Grace, and I think you're writing another one, correct? Is that?
I'm trying to, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, here's your push. Here's your encouragement. Here's your nudge. I know. We know what that's like. Are there any other? And you've mentioned scriptures here, which is just so helpful. But other than the Bible, we mentioned, Elizabeth Elliot. You mentioned John Piper. Dan, what are there any other resources that have been really helpful to you that you've been able to lean into, either individually or as a couple, that would be good?
I've enjoyed Paul David Tripp's book. I believe he wrote the book Suffering. I think I have that correct.
Yes.
And that is an excellent book. And also his devotional, New Morning Mercies.
New Morning Mercies, that's right.
New Morning Mercies,
Yep.
yes. Those two books have been very encouraging to me. They can get deep theologically, but he is so spot on when it comes to the theology of suffering. And so I feel like I've gleaned a lot of knowledge from his experience in life too.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'll mention another one that we've had Diane Langberg on. So Suffering in the Heart of God is a great book. Diane's a counselor. We've had her on the podcast a couple of times. And so that book, Suffering in the Heart of God. And if we think of anything else, Chris, we'll add that, okay, when we get this thing to drop. So Dan and Kristin, I know we got to draw it to a close. Thank you so much. This is awesome. We're going to continue to track with you. And I did tell them during the break that if we do the Northeast Youth Ministry Summit, it's going on record here. If we do the Northeast Youth Ministry Summit next year, we're going to get you to come and help youth workers walk through how to teach a theology of suffering to our kids just through your own story and your own study. I'm going to ask one last question, okay? This is, as you tell your story, I see smiles on your faces, and I hear encouragement. From where I sit, having not gone through what you've gone through, there's every now and then, a little bit of disbelief visits me, and it's not disbelief of your story, but it's the disbelief of, could I ever do this? Would God's grace be sufficient for me? How do you do this? And I've asked this question before people who've been through really difficult things. If you could rewind and go back to, Kristin, when you're 16 and you have no idea, what's going on in your body and you have no idea of what lies ahead, would you change any of this?
I wouldn't, not for a second. I would not change 1 minute of what God has allowed in my life. Now, I think there's a difference between being thankful for the journey and wishing to go through it again, but I could not be more grateful for the journey because my faith and who I have seen God to be will never be the same because of what I've gone through.
For sure. Yeah. Don't want to go through each situation again, but yeah, just thankful you come through on the end.
Yeah.
Just reflecting on Heidelberg Catechism question answer number 1.
Oh, I love that.
What is your only
one,
comfort in life and death? But I'm not my own, but belong to God. And that's just a huge reminder to us.
Body and soul. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good. Let's end on a good Reformed note. Christian Reformed Church guy. We love the Heidelberg Catechism here. One of the things we've been trying to do is get youth workers who have never been familiar with catechisms to read them, embrace them, and teach them to their students. So
yes.
Thank you for mentioning that. That was not prompted, listeners. That was really just a good thing. So those truths that we lean into. Well, thank you so much. We love you guys, and we're going to continue to pray for you. It's been a privilege, I would say, to kind of tap into your story and have you here today. So thanks so much for that. So to all of you, thank you. So to all of you who are listening, we hope that you've been ministered to, as Chris and I have here, as we've sat here today and listened to this, and we look forward to seeing you, chatting with you on the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.